Nobody sent me out there because they believed in me. They sent me because I was available, and because the posting had a reputation for breaking the men assigned to it. Not violently, just slowly, the way wind breaks stone. 3 months, the rumor ran. 3 months, and a man starts talking to himself. 6 months and he stops answering when command calls. A year and they send someone else. And the first one stays anyway because there's nowhere particular to go back to. I lasted 30 years. The Verith Plateau sits at the outer rim of what used to be a defense installation, back when the outer rim meant something. The installation is a ruin now. Collapsed domes, derelict antenna arrays, the ghost of a fuel depot that nobody bothered to formally decommission, because decommissioning requires paperwork, and paperwork requires someone to care. The Defense Force kept the posting alive for one reason only: the pod. They called it a pod. That was the entire classification. I checked the records my first week out, looked for a designation, a registration, a construction date, anything. The file was 3 lines. Anomalous sealed unit, origin undetermined. Embedded in the basalt cliff face at grid reference Verith 7. Maintenance required. I asked my supervisor what that meant. He said, "Keep it from falling apart." I asked what was inside. He said he didn't know. I asked who did know. He said the file didn't list anyone. I asked if I was supposed to open it. Long pause. "No," he said. "Definitely not that." So I didn't open it. I maintained it. It sat 40 meters up the cliff face in a natural recess, like something had pressed it there from behind. The material wasn't basalt, wasn't any alloy in the standard database. Smooth where it should have been rough, seamless where it should have had joins. The surface was the dark gray of deep ocean water in winter, and it absorbed light the way nothing I'd ever worked on absorbed light. Not reflecting, not quite, just taking it in and giving nothing back. It was 11 meters long, 2 meters across at the widest point. The profile from below was vaguely like a seed, or a coffin, depending on the hour of the day and what kind of man I was being that afternoon. Once a month I went up. I ran the external scan, always the same reading, dormant, stable, sealed. I checked the material for degradation, and almost never found any. When I did find a crack or a spall, I packed it with sealant compound, the kind rated for extreme cold application, and I smoothed it flat, and I let it cure, and I came back the next week to check it. The sealant never held the way sealant should. By the next month it would be gone, reabsorbed or expelled by the surface, and the material underneath would be intact as if the crack had never been. The pod was healing itself. My work was, in a strict technical sense, unnecessary. I kept doing it anyway. I kept doing it because the orders said maintain, and I was the kind of man who follows orders, not because he fears the consequences of not following them, but because he genuinely believes that if a thing is worth assigning, it is worth doing. There's a difference. Took me years on that plateau to understand the difference mattered. I had no company to teach me otherwise. Just the thin air, and the pale sky, and the alien rock that rang like a bell if you hit it wrong, and the pod that sat in its recess, and said nothing, and asked nothing, and watched me come back, month after month, for 30 years. It was the 29th of November, by my reckoning, when the fracture appeared. I saw it before I ran the scan, a hairline running the full length of the pod along the lower seam, stem to stern, 11 meters of crack in material I had never seen crack. My first thought was that something had shifted in the cliff. My second was that I should call it in. I did neither for a long moment. I just stood on the access platform and looked at it. 11 meters, perfectly straight, as if scored with a precision tool from the inside. I packed the sealant. It was cold that morning. The plateau runs 20 below in late autumn, the kind of cold that makes your fingers slow and your thinking deliberate. I worked the compound along the seam by hand because the applicator gun loses pressure in that temperature, and I had learned years ago not to rely on it. The work took 2 hours. When I was done, I had sealant-covered gloves and a sealed seam, and the bone-deep tiredness that follows 2 hours of careful work in the cold. I sat back against the pod to rest. That was all I did. I finished the work, and I was tired, and the cliff face blocked the worst of the wind at that position, and I sat down against the surface of the thing I had maintained for 30 years, and I leaned my back into it, and I closed my eyes for a moment. The surface was warm. Not the warmth of a material that had absorbed the ambient temperature. It was warm the way a living thing is warm, from the inside, with intention. I had my eyes closed. I kept them closed. I didn't move. My heart was doing something in my chest that I couldn't fully name. Not panic, not fear. Something older than either. Something closer to the feeling you have when you've been waiting for a very long time for something you couldn't name, and suddenly the waiting is ending. The seam I had just packed began to separate. I heard it before I felt it, a low harmonic, too low for most men, that I had lived long enough in silence to hear clearly. Not a mechanical sound, not a pressure sound. The sound of something enormous deciding to wake. The platform vibrated under me. I got to my feet and stepped back and looked at it, and the sealant I had applied 2 hours ago was gone, the compound simply absent, and the seam was parting along its full 11-meter length, not cracking, not breaking, but opening. Deliberate, measured, the way a held breath releases. Light came through. Not the cyan of electronics. Not the amber of heating coils. White, the clean, sourceless white of a thing that had been waiting so long it had stopped caring what it looked like when it finally moved. The light flooded the recess and caught the basalt dust that lived in every crevice of that cliff face and turned it for a moment into something close to gold. The lid rose. The figure inside was sealed in armor I had no name for. The alloy was the same dark gray as the pod, the same material, I understood then, the same substance. The man and the vessel, one continuous thing. The armor was designed for a body that was human in proportion, but broader across the shoulders than any man I had known, and it had been sealed so completely that I could not see the face, and could not see the hands, and could not tell age or expression, just a figure, standing now, where there had been nothing for 3,000 years. A scanner reading on a file. An anomalous sealed unit. A thing to maintain. It stood for a moment without moving. I didn't speak. I had 30 years of practice at not speaking into silence, and I used all of it. I stood on my platform, and I looked up at the figure, and I waited the way I had learned to wait out there, without expectation, without demand, with the particular patience that comes from understanding that some things move on their own time, and no amount of wanting speeds them. Then it spoke. The voice was not amplified. It did not need to be. It was the voice of something that had been waiting longer than my civilization had existed to say this particular thing to this particular man, and it came across the cold plateau air with a weight that I felt in the chest and in the bones. The watch was kept. 5 words. That was all. But I had been out on the Verith Plateau for 30 years, alone, maintaining something I was not allowed to open, following orders no one had thought to rescind, packing sealant into cracks that healed themselves, coming back month after month in the cold and the thin air and the silence, and I understood in the moment, those 5 words landed what I had actually been doing all that time. I had not been repairing it. I had been the last link in something so old it had outlasted the people who built it. A covenant of readiness. A vigil that needed a human hand and a human stubbornness and a human willingness to keep showing up when there was no reason to, and no one watching, and no reward. The pod had not needed my sealant. The pod had needed to know that someone was still coming, that the species it had been designed to serve still produced the kind of person who does the thankless work, because it is the work. I stood there on the platform in the cold and looked up at 3,000 years of patience standing on alien rock, and I said nothing, because nothing needed saying. The vigil was done. I was done. Something had waited for me to be the last watchman, and I had been. That's all it took. I had just patched the sealant and sat down to rest. But that was enough. The watch was kept. and the one who had been waiting inside could finally stand.